Minimalists.
What are your thoughts on the difference between guilt and shame being a primary trigger to lead someone to become addicted to porn?
I think it's really fascinating, and I have a article that we're going to talk about on the Maximal episode, because I do think that part of what's going on right now with the shame and guilt around sexuality and thus to porn has to do with we've been acculturated to be ashamed of our bodies, of sex, of sexual expression, right? How did you get over that? Because especially the time when you started, it was a giant leap for you to have to make. And did you ever struggle with guilt or shame at all, before or after?
I struggled with everyone else's. Everyone else's guilt and shame was projected on me to the point where I can't tell you how many apartments I was denied access, banks I was denied service. In the late 80s, early 90s, as a girl in this industry taking money into a bank, there were women that would just not deal with you. They would just send you out. Yeah. So I dealt with not feeling it myself, because to me, this was my choice. I used to tell people, you're letting this bother you and this doesn't bother me. Yeah. I'm a sexual being. I had 3 very simple goals at 16, which was to travel and see the world, make my own money, and make my own schedule. Adult life porn fulfilled that for me. You know what I mean? I got to see the world. So the guilt for me is only when someone projects it on me. Sometimes I can remember in my dating life, I'd go on a date with somebody, I think they'd be really into me, and then I realized they want me to explain to them how I deal with my guilt. And I don't have any guilt, which they're going to be bothered by because they have a ton of guilt, and they need me to pacify them so that they can consider dating me, because really they just wanted to see what it would be like. And now that they think they kind of like me, they don't know how to process the information, right? It's a very select person to process the information. We shouldn't be ashamed of our bodies. I have a much more European mindset, whereas they're so open in other countries. We're so held off. That's why porn makes so much money, because if we make people think it's bad, then they want it more, like drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, what have you. So for me, it's not my guilt. I mean, I've had, especially during the pandemic when the world was closed, I sat down with myself and said, how glad are you that you took every fucking chance you could? Here we are sitting locked in our places. I have no regrets. Yeah. If it's sex with people in other countries that never spoke English, I worked on sets in a whole room of people that spoke different languages, and our only common language was sex. And I feel so liberated by these choices that I made and these chances that I took. So people have to understand that you're the guard of your own thoughts when it comes to shame and guilt. Criminals feel shame and guilt, right? They're sitting in a cell and they have to sit and think about what horrible things they did that got them there, which is awful. Sexually, you shouldn't feel shame or guilt.
Let's talk about shame versus guilt here. Let's have a quick, pithy answer, and then we'll unpack it here. Guilt tells us something about our actions, but shame says something about our identity. So ultimately, if we do something, like you said, as a criminal, you might do something once. It doesn't make you that person. Nope. You made a mistake or a bad decision, depending on, those are 2 different things, but maybe you made a bad decision. That doesn't mean that's who you are as a person. Right. But if you're that person who continues to rob bank after bank after bank, you're probably a bank robber. Yeah. Right?
You're that person.
Yeah. And so ultimately, you're going to feel shame because that's who I've become. I've become this person. Well, guess what? How do you change that shame? It's by stop doing the actions that created the guilt that ultimately created the shame. And now, but what we're talking about here is not a specific action. Sex isn't the thing that we should feel guilty about. Humans have always done it. Are we going to act like that's not something it's been happening for 200,000 years plus in humanity? And so that's not the thing to feel guilty about. What we feel guilty about is this moralizing that has happened in our society. And Ryan and I, we have different beliefs. We have similar values, though. So we bring a lot of different people on the podcast. The first time you were scheduled to be on here, there were some COVID-related things. You weren't able to make it. We had a pastor on that same day instead, right?
What a swap out.
I even told him that. His name's Erwin McManus, and but he's a different kind of pastor who isn't a moralizing sort of person. In fact, the church that he started, he didn't let Christians come to it for the first couple years.
Because they're too judgmental? Because they're too judgmental.
He was afraid. Because he himself is a Christian. He was afraid that Christians were going to ruin his sort of Christianity in a way, because he didn't want to be judgmental. He wanted to create this thing for people who You want to create a space of openness. And I think that's what we're talking about right now when we're talking about whether it's porn or we're talking about any of our other proclivities. We need the space to even talk about these things. Yeah. And I think even a conversation like what we're having right now can be incredibly taboo for some people because of the guilt that they are feeling. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you have done something wrong necessarily. It means that you're told the thing that you want is wrong, that your desire is wrong, that your human tendencies are wrong. But I don't think that gets us very far.
No.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, kids are getting married at 17, 18 years old because they're not allowed to have sex before marriage. So they don't want to live in sin. So they end up getting married. And I can't tell you how many of them end in divorce, or worse, they're still married and can't stand each other. Oof. So, I mean, it is so important to question why we feel guilty. In fact, my pithy answer is this. Learning from your guilt can help you avoid shame. So if you watch porn and you feel guilty, that is a symptom of something. And you've got to ask yourself, why do I feel guilty? Is it because I'm told I should feel guilty? Is it because I had this sexual experience without my partner? I mean, to examine why you feel guilty, that's really what's going to help you move forward. And then you learn from that guilt. Either you learn something about your morals, or you learn something about you'll learn something about yourself. If you don't learn from your guilt, then you will get to a point where you start to be ashamed of who you are. So the bank robber who's robbing multiple banks eventually is going to be like, well, I'm a bank robber, so that's what I'm going to do.
Sure, accepted it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they reconcile with, okay, I have to become, now I am this person. I've become the sort of the bad guy. I love what you're saying here, Ryan, about guilt, because, well, I think where was I going to go with this?
There's so many ways to go with it.
Yeah. So if someone is feeling guilt because the society has propped them up some way, we call it a mimetic belief, right? It just means that society has said something is wrong or taboo, and we may not feel that intrinsically that something is wrong or taboo, and so there's this cognitive dissonance. Now, Lisa Ann, you were able to avoid that cognitive dissonance in a way. And I know you mentor younger, I would call them kids now, but people in their 20s.
They could be my children.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And many of them come to me because they can have conversations with me that they just don't feel comfortable having with their parents or friends their age. I love having younger friends because younger people keep you so inspired. I mean, their level of movement now, they're so creative. Every young kid knows how to edit, create, do everything from a laptop. Like, you could take them to another country and they'll put you out 10 YouTube videos. You know what I mean? Like, the things they know how to do. But yet, they haven't had those conversations with their parents. They're very intimidated by porn. Think about being a young woman and trying to watch porn for your first time. It's much more geared towards men than it was when I started in the 90s. There's not a lot there for them. And then it makes them afraid. Oh, are these things going to happen to me when I go to have sex with a guy?
Yeah.
So I'll tell young people, for every one porno scene you watch, I want you to read a romance novel. Because when I grew up, all of my aunts read these romance novels. And so eventually I took one and I realized, oh my gosh, this is reading porn.
Yeah. They're pretty steamy.
They're so steamy. They're so steamy. And yet they get the juices flowing, right? But then there's a cliff because, you have to visualize your own sex scene. But see, that's a really good thing for a young woman. Because if you take that next step and you visualize the sex scene, you're almost creating what you think turns you on. You're visualizing what this man would look like, how he would touch you as you're reading this. So I think we need to kind of roll it back. That's a really good sex education, is playing the mental game with yourself, getting your heart racing a little bit and feeling it rather than they just go to it. I mean, there's so much kissing talk in those romance novels. I was young. I was like 10. I was like, why do my aunts read these things like cover to cover? And then I got it. We don't offer that in porn right now. So I think for me, teaching young people to roll it back, to be limiting what they're watching, but also to trust each other and to want to touch and see how it feels. When I was younger, we were a little bit freer. We would have more experimental sex. We would talk during it. We weren't as held back. I think this generation is a bit more scared to do that because they're afraid it will get out on social media. Somebody might take a photo. Somebody might tell a friend, oh, I was with him and he couldn't get it up. They're so afraid of their peers now. We didn't have that. Who was going to tell? And if they did, who was going to believe them?
Right.
But back then, people didn't speak about it, gossip about it. They respected it.
Yeah.
This enhances the sort of guilt, right? What you were talking about earlier, like if you watch porn and then you feel guilty from it, that may be the case, but the guilt could stem from several reasons. Sometimes the guilt might be justified. Like when I talked about earlier, my first marriage, I should feel guilt for that because what I was doing was hiding something. Not that I was watching porn. It wasn't the porn that was the problem in that relationship.
Right.
It was me, and it was our compatibility that was a problem in that relationship. And so I felt guilty, not because of watching the porn, and this is just in retrospect, but I felt guilty because I was hiding something from someone that I loved.
And you weren't sharing your needs with that person either. You were handling them on your own. You felt very selfish guilt about that too.
Absolutely.
Because now you knew she wasn't going to get taken care of either. So in the back of your mind, you had guilt about that as well.
Yeah. And so when I finally came to terms with like, hey, maybe it's not the porn that is the problem here, at least in that relationship. It was a lack of communication, unwillingness to be myself with the person who's closest to me. And I was putting up a sort of facade, right? And so I think that, and then eventually the shame came in because like, well, I guess I'm the type of person who goes and like hides in his office and masturbates to porn instead of having a difficult conversation with my wife. Right. That is a problem. And that's when porn becomes a problem. But then now in my marriage now, it's sort of an augmentation. It's an amplification. It's not a crutch. We don't use it regularly, but when if we did, that'd be fine. But what happens is we use it when it feels appropriate. And
a little decadent.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I loved when I was on the road and I'd be at strip clubs and there'd be couples that would come in once a month. They would go out for like a nice dinner and then they'd go to the strip club together. And it was just their thing they did once a month. And some of them were really just people watchers, right? But it was something they shared that was so unique. And it just made me happy in the late 90s when I started to see couples evolving. When I started, the owners didn't let women into clubs. So even if you were a couple, the owners back then would say, well, these women will take away from my women making money and there'll be fights over these women. I'm like, no, these are couples that want to come in and do this together and maybe share in a dance and talk about what they like in a girl. And then, of course, they went home and had great sex, right?
Yeah.
And finally, this started to evolve, and it made me very happy because I would see couples, and the girls would always treat them really well too. Because the girls would be like, "This is so cool! You guys are doing this together," and it was their thing, just like you guys watching something together. It was just kicking it up a little notch together.
Yeah.
So if we were to sum this up, would we say that porn is a problem when you become dependent on it, just like or when it gets in the way of living meaningfully, and that I think you could substitute porn with alcohol, because it's not inherently evil, right? You could substitute it with work. There are workaholics where that destroys their life, right? But no one's saying, well, I guess we should stop working now because one guy happens to be addicted to working. No, what we need to say is there's a responsible amount that we need to figure out that's appropriate for our own lives. And so the bad seems to happen when it gets in the way or we become dependent on it. The good happens when it amplifies our experience of life.
I also think the bad happens when you are too young. Age plays a huge role in this. I mean, under 18, haven't had any of your... Imagine your first experience is with a porn and not with a girl.
Yeah.
So I think it's age, when it came into your life, and then how much free time you had to watch it. I think it being accessible on phones is really creating havoc, and that's why when he said mid-20s, I was like, bing, 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 I know exactly what his problem is.
Yeah.
He was locked in his room watching it for endless hours a day for probably 5-10 years.
Yeah, and that creates an unhealthy relationship with other people because they're not actually you're not seeing them necessarily as other people at that point,
right? And you're not engaging.
No,
you're not engaging with other people. You're not going out flirting with girls. You're just sitting and watching something that can be really destructing and really disturbing.
Yeah, and it can ruin you in a lot of ways. Another thing Dan Savage often says, he talks about death grip
I
syndrome.
was just thinking that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically it's, guys who masturbate so frequently they're unable to, just get off with it with another partner.
Yeah.
And I think that what's happening is your mind all of a sudden now associates horniness or attraction with that glowing screen as opposed to that other human being who
And
is in your
remember,
life.
the stunt people that are acting like they're enjoying it more than they actually are. That it is shot with a fisheye lens that makes the guy look larger than he actually is.
Right.
Where there's tons of lubricants to make the girl look wet. Like everything about it is amplified like a stunt movie, like a stunt. So it's such an unrealistic. When I did my speech at Oxford Union, I said 99% of what you saw on the internet, don't ever ask a girl to do any of that for you.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen, and you're most likely going to offend her and freak her out. So reel it in. But there's so much they see, and I think too young is very destructive.
Yeah.